Hey everyone, welcome back to more Flesh and Bad, and today we're going to be doing an in-person Marlynn deck tech. So I just got back from US Nationals where I made 39th with Marlynn, so I think the deck is finally in a really good spot, and I went 7-2 in CC, so I think the deck is very strong. But yeah, I want to do like a little bit of an in-person deck tech to kind of walk through a lot of the new changes to the deck and also the card choices, and also kind of describe how you can take Marlynn to your Nationals and also crush it as well. Before we get into the video, I kind of want to just give a brief overview of Marlynn for people who haven't really played her before. So I kind of think of her as more of like this kind of like tempo, mid-range deck. She's not very aggressive, she's not very defensive, but she's a very disruptive deck. So she has a lot of very annoying and kind of painful effects for your opponent to deal with. And she also has like a lot of really cool fatigue equity. So she comes kind of paired with this Hammerhead Harpoon, which basically gives you like 4 value every turn that you're able to activate it. So it makes the deck very hard to fatigue and also kind of gives you like a lot of value generation over the course of the game. Now, the biggest challenge for the deck is kind of getting the resources to kind of pay for Hammerhead Harpoon. We'll kind of talk about that in a little bit here. But Marlynn as a whole is kind of like, you can almost kind of think of her as like these two cards, basically, just like the hero text itself, as well as kind of like the Hammerhead text, which kind of enables a lot of your Harpoons. So yeah, now that we've kind of discussed like Marlynn as a hero, I also kind of wanted to get into kind of like the strongest cards in the deck. So this is what the entire deck is built around, is basically built around the kind of Harpoon cards. We're currently running 3 of each, basically. So I kind of have them in little stacks here, but basically we're running 21 Harpoons in the deck, and each of them have like their own unique kind of disruptive effect, which I think is very powerful. So the first, I guess, like the 2 best Harpoons that we kind of like to think about are King Shark and King Kraken Harpoon. So King Shark Harpoon is probably like one of the best effects in the game. Basically threatens attack action cards from your opponent's hand if you have activated your Hammerhead, which is what you want to be doing with the deck basically almost every turn. And King Shark is specifically really annoying because most decks in the game run some number of attack actions. There are some decks that don't, but we'll kind of get to that in a little bit. But King Shark is definitely like one of the strongest kind of cards in the deck. Now, King Shark is also paired kind of with King Kraken. So where King Shark kind of only looks at attack action cards, King Kraken is only looking for non-attack action cards. So they pair very well. They pair very well together into decks that are running like a nice mix of some. So like Jarl, for instance. But you can also kind of like think about cutting these in some matchups where your opponent's like not running either attack actions or not running non-attack actions. So maybe like a common example of this would be into like Wizards, right? Wizards tend to not run a ton of attack actions. Well, some Vasilios do, but in general, there are some Vasilios that like might not run a ton of attack actions, in which case you would only really want like Kraken in that matchup, for instance. So yeah, King Shark and King Kraken are some of the kind of like most powerful Harpoons, but these are kind of like, I like to think of these more kind of like as sideboard pieces, but you can kind of consider them to be main deck into at least like 70% of the decks in Fab right now. To also kind of pair with these big red Harpoons, which are very powerful, we also have a bunch of our blue and yellow Harpoons. So I'll kind of talk through Shallow Water Shark Harpoon first, as this is a kind of like unique addition from Compendium. Basically is an Arsenal Disruption Harpoon, which is like a very unique effect, and it doesn't have Go Fish on it, which is kind of this keyword that you kind of see on the King Shark and King Kraken Harpoons. Just because it doesn't have Go Fish doesn't mean it's not a very good card. Shallow Water is like still very solid. But yeah, Shallow Water kind of just generically good into everyone, because everyone in the game wants to kind of keep an arsenal. And even if you're just threatening like a defense reaction or something like that, the effect is still very strong. Next, I'm going to talk through the kind of blue Harpoons. So we have our 3 kind of like original Harpoons here in the form of Redfin, Bluefin, and Yellowfin Harpoons. So these are all looking for reds, blues, and yellows, respectively, from your opponent. And then we also have the new addition from Omens of the Third Age, which is Red Lord Harpoon. This is a very unique effect, which we'll also kind of talk about here in a second. A common question I think I get about specifically the blue Harpoons and kind of their space and like reason for being in the deck is like, okay, Redfin makes sense, right? Like we want to take reds from our opponent's hand. Bluefin also makes sense, like we want to take blues from our opponent's hand. But there aren't a lot of decks in the game that want to run a ton of yellows. So like Yellowfin Harpoon is definitely like a little bit more niche. Now, the kind of important thing about Yellowfin Harpoon you kind of have to remember is that a lot of the most kind of like powerful cards in the game, like Codex of Frailty, like Lumina Ascension, like all of these like really interesting like specializations and like power cards, Blood Rush Bellow, for instance, like there are a lot of really powerful yellow cards in the game that you still can often kind of threaten with the Yellowfin Harpoon. So even if you're not taking them out of hand, if you're forcing your opponent to block with them, then you're also kind of getting a lot of value. And now we'll kind of talk about the newest addition to the deck, which is Red Lure Harpoon. So this is kind of like this has kind of almost fundamentally kind of changed the way that the Marlyn deck is built now, because with Red Lure Harpoon, you basically want to be using your Sea Lice Sorong like a lot more frequently to kind of like give this effect go again, or just give like another Harpoon go again, so that you can use the card that you kind of banished with Red Lure Harpoon. It's kind of like also kind of brought the deck into like a different direction with some of the blues that we kind of include in the deck. So like Tip the Barkeep is now, we're going to talk about that in a second, but we've now actually kind of found like a super compelling reason to run Tip the Barkeep in the deck as just a way to kind of like give random things we banish go again, or to also give our own Harpoons go again, so that we can maybe even like make a Red Lure Harpoon have go again, and then like banish maybe like an E-Strike or a CNC from our opponent, and then like send a CNC at our opponent, which is really good. So yeah, Red Lure Harpoon is like a really cool addition to the deck that also I think really helps a lot into more redline strategies, as well as just fatigue and also some certain matchups. All right, so now that we've kind of discussed a little bit of how Marlyn works and also the arrows and disruptive effects that we kind of want to be sending, I wanted to kind of briefly touch on the power cards of the deck, of which there are 6. So we have 3 copies of 3 of a Kind, as well as 3 copies of Codex of Frailty. So Codex of Frailty, obviously very, very powerful effect, letting you kind of get any Harpoon you want from your graveyard, typically like King Shark, King Kraken, kind of depends on the context. But it's also still really good if you end up getting like a blue fin, red fin. Like Codex of Frailty is probably one of the most versatile cards in the game. Also just gives you a ton of value, like giving you a Ponder token and Frailty. So yeah, not really much to talk about in terms of Codex of Frailty. Is just one of the best cards in the game, and we get to run it, which is fantastic. And then we're also going to talk about 3 of a Kind. So 3 of a Kind is a very powerful effect, allowing us to draw 3 cards, but we can't actually play the cards unless they're from Arsenal. So 3 of a Kind is kind of like almost like this super blue in the deck, basically kind of representing like almost like 5 or 6 resources when you can like draw the cards on average. Often it can even be better than that, because you can draw like 2 blues and then like a red to like Arsenal next turn. So 3 of a Kind is just a very, very powerful card, just allowing you to kind of cycle through your deck faster, and then also kind of just get a ton of value the turn you play it. Typically with 3 of a Kind, it's best paired with a bunch of the buffs in the deck, which we're going to kind of get into in the next section. But basically the entire deck is built around maximizing value off 3 of a Kind, and also just using its effect to kind of like get an overwhelming advantage on our opponent. All right, so next let's go on to the bread and butter of the Marlyn deck, which are our buffs. So while sending a King Shark Harpoon for 10 overpower is nice and all, we really want to kind of try to push that attack power so that it's a little bit better than just 10, right? We want like 13, 16, 20. We want to pump those numbers up.
I gotta pump those numbers up. Those are rookie numbers in this racket.
So the way that we do that is by playing these buff cards. So buff cards are basically just anything that modifies the attack power of just like any other attack action in our deck. So in the main deck, we have basically 12 buff cards, but I also kind of consider Murderous Rabble to be like kind of a pseudo buff card, basically allowing us to kind of extend on turns when we kind of have just like an extra card in hand. But we'll kind of talk through, I guess, like the main buffs first. And I've also set pre-med aside here because we're going to talk pre-med in a little bit here. But first, let's talk about Cheating Scoundrel. So probably one of the better includes from Compendium, just being a 0 for 3 red that buffs any attack action card is very powerful. Also giving the gold on hit is super relevant because gold is kind of like one of the main resources that we use to kind of like cycle through our deck, as well as like load arrows, make Goldfin Harpoons. It's very, very versatile in terms of the kind of like amount of flexibility gold has. But Cheating Scoundrel at a 3 block is also just kind of like I want to include in the deck. It's just a very, very powerful effect that there's not really a better version of. Next, we'll talk about Big Game Trophy Shot. So I've actually had like a lot of people not really like this card all that much, which is kind of crazy to me. So this card is kind of best used when you can actually like activate Marlynn. So you tap Marlynn, make a Goldfin Harpoon to hand, and then you can basically like discard the Goldfin Harpoon to Big Game Trophy Shot to kind of like cheat the discard effect on it, basically. But it's basically like a 2-for-4 buff card that like often will draw you a card back. So it's very, very powerful. You can almost kind of think of this as like -1 resource if you're drawing like a blue off the top, because you've pitched 2 to draw a blue, so that basically you're kind of going like almost up on resources, which is kind of good. But it also just gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of loading. Works really well on like 2 blue hands where you have like 2 blues, Big Game Trophy Shot, you make like Goldfin, you can send like 10 overpower. Overall, Big Game Trophy Shot, just like one of the best cards in the deck. Just very, very powerful and potent effect, and also has the on hit of making gold as well. Next, we're going to talk about Gold to Tip. So I've actually had like a lot of people beat down on Gold to Tip, mainly because I feel like people don't understand the kind of role that it serves in the deck. So the best way to think about Gold to Tip is that you kind of have to think of this almost as a red buff, but it just pitches for 1 extra, which is very powerful. So it's almost like a red buff that gives us an extra resource when we pitch it. Compare it to kind of like Premeditate, right? Where we basically have like a red buff that has like an on hit of making a Ponder token, which is very, very strong. But we also have Gold to Tip, which is basically like not having an on hit, but it just gives you us +3 and doesn't really have, or it has like a more niche effect of like if we have a yellow, then we make a gold, which is a bit harder, I think, to activate. It did get a little bit easier to activate with like Shallow Water Shark Harpoon or whatever, but for the most part, like this is kind of like just a yellow 0-for-3 buff is kind of how you think about it. The reason why Gold to Tip is in the deck is because having yellows in the deck is still really, really strong. So I kind of want to give kind of an example of this. So let's take this kind of like opening hand here. We don't have an arsenal and we're trying to load a King Shark Harpoon. We have 2 blues in hand and also this like red Premeditate, for instance. And we have 1 gold sitting on the field because maybe we're running like Crown and Dominion or something else. But basically, we're pretending that this card is kind of like the top card of the deck. So if I go ahead and pitch this Tip of the Barkeep to maybe float a resource and draw a card, if we draw this yellow, this actually makes our entire hand kind of functional, right? Because we have 5 resources here, we load the King Shark Harpoon, we play the pre-med, and then we have that 1 resource floating from the gold crack to basically kind of offset the cost of the Gold to Tip, which is very strong. So having yellows in the deck is still really important because it allows you to be like a little bit more risky with cracking gold, or allows you to have like a little bit more insurance that you're not going to like just hit like another random red off the top. All right, and finally, I want to kind of talk about our last main deck buff, which is Catch of the Day. So this is kind of like a very powerful effect that was printed in Super Slam. This basically allows us to double the effects of our Go Fish, but it's also just a +2 on a blue 3 block, which makes it almost like an auto include in the deck. But Catch of the Day is really, really powerful, especially on cards like King Shark Harpoon or Redfin Harpoon, because you can often threaten like a crippling crush-like effect. So stripping 2 cards from your opponent, even if they block, which is just incredible. So Catch of the Day, probably one of the most powerful cards in the deck. Just a very, very good card, one of the best cards in slot, and just kind of lets you kind of go a little bit taller on your arrows. All right, and finally, I wanted to talk about Murderous Rabble. So Murderous Rabble is not really a buff in the sense that it doesn't modify the attack power of your harpoons, so it doesn't really make it necessarily easier to hit with your harpoons. But it is actually just like a really nice extender in kind of like the same way that the buffs are. So you can kind of think as like Murderous Rebel as like a 0-for-3 blue 3 block that doesn't buff the arrow, but does just give you 3 extra damage if you're trying to close the game, which is really strong. Murderous Rebel also has like a lot of really cool like niche applications. So like one thing that you can do against like Spectra, right, is if you do like give a Harpoon go again, maybe with like Sea Lace Sarong, and then you just like throw a Murderous Rebel or something, you can like clear the Spectra that way. It's also just very good into ally-based decks, so like into maybe Kasai, making like Centauri Sellswords, or also just into Gravy Bones. Being able to like threaten a kill on like a Rigor Mortis is just like very, very strong. So Murderous Rebel is just like a generically good card, just being like a blue 3 block, but also just has like a lot of like really cool applications into some of the best decks right now. And the final buff that I want to talk about is Premeditate. So I actually kind of don't really main deck this card. This is kind of more of a sideboard card, but I do often find myself running 2 copies in the main board just because I think I like to play a little bit more aggressively. And Premed is definitely like a very aggressive kind of stat line. So it's a red 0-for-3, and it also threatens a card draw on hit. So it's almost like a Saber Bloodshed like effect, which is like very, very good. So yeah, Premeditates I kind of consider to be a little bit more sideboard than main deck, although I do often find myself kind of running 2 in the main deck. But the third one I kind of often leave in the sideboard, and there's kind of like a very important role that the premeditates fill. So often what I'll do in matchups where one of our big red harpoons is not very good is I'll bring in all three premeditates to basically swap for the harpoons. So let's say we're running into like a wizard, for instance, right? Like a Cilio. And maybe they're on like the kind of like go tall arcane Cilia or something. But in that case, the King Shark harpoons are not going to be very good, right? So basically what we do is we just kind of throw those away. And we basically swap them entirely for premeditate. And what premeditate does is it lets us be a lot more aggressive. So if we have 3 of a kind in our deck, basically, we can kind of like play a bit more towards 3 of a kind, basically like play buff, and then 3 of a kind, and then draw like some random arrow. Like it basically allows us to go like a lot taller than we normally would, which is very important in matchups where like one of our harpoons is bad, because it means we're kind of like almost at a little bit of a disadvantage. So yeah, I really like running like 2 premeditates in the main board, and then the third premeditate kind of just like flexes in if we want to like cut our harpoons entirely. All right, so now that we've talked through the arrows and the buffs and the power cards in the deck, I kind of want to talk through some of the utility cards, most of which are kind of like these blue 3 blocks that we include in the deck, but each of these kind of serve like a very important role. So I'm going to go ahead and start with kind of our gold generation cards. So we have our Seafloor Salvages and our Sunken Treasures and our Portside Exchanges. So all these are really strong effects. Sunken Treasure basically being a blue 3 block on block, make a gold is very, very strong. Sometimes you won't have the yellow in the bin, but very often just with our own deck that we can kind of like get a yellow in the bin eventually and then start generating gold that way. We also have Seafloor Salvage. This effect is like a little bit worse than Sunken Treasure if our opponent is not like attacking into us or whatever. But basically like Seafloor Salvage, we have to like actually play it out, which is like a little bit of a downside because it means that we don't get to just like get free 3 value off of like Sunken Treasure, right? But Seafloor Salvage is still like a really very strong effect. Basically lets us kind of like play this very interesting game into Gravy Bones, where we can kind of like turn over some of their allies and they can't like leave allies in the bin. So Seafloor Salvage is still just like a very, very powerful card. And it's kind of like a card that you want to play when you're kind of like ahead on resources. So like if you're in a spot where you're like already kind of steamrolling your opponent and you have like the tempo, you can basically like play it out to kind of just get like a little bit of extra value on a turn that you might not otherwise have been able to do. And also just kind of has like the floor of being a blue 3 block, so you can use it to block if you need, you can use it to pitch. It's just a very, very flexible card. And lastly, we'll talk about Portside Exchange. So this card is really, really important because it basically lets you kind of like get a kind of like a load trigger off Marlynn. So you can often like crack a gold with Marlynn, make like a Goldfin Harpoon hand, and then just immediately discard that Goldfin Harpoon to basically go net even on the gold and then also get a load trigger. And what this also will enable is your Gold Baited Hook. So Gold Baited Hook, just a very, very powerful effect to enable and kind of just like a way to kind of generate extra value over the course of the game. All right, so those were kind of like our gold generating blues. We also just have Eye of Ophidia. Eye of Ophidia is just a very, very powerful effect in Marlynn. Letting you inform your draws and just get a bit of card selection is just very, very strong. Opting 2 is just kind of like insane on a blue. So even though it doesn't like block, I'm basically like always happy to see Eye of Ophidia. Eye of Ophidia is like one of the best cards in the deck just because it lets you kind of see more of your deck faster, which is kind of what the deck is all about. And then we have these last 6 blues here, which are Tip the Barkeep and Sif. So let's talk about Tip the Barkeep first, because I think this is a little bit more of an interesting include. So Tip the Barkeep is kind of an effect that was always kind of like experimented around with Marlynn, but never really saw like a ton of play. But this card actually became a lot better with the addition of Red Lure Harpoon in the deck. So these 2 combo in a very interesting way, because basically what you can do is you can like play Red Lure Harpoon on maybe like previous turn, like maybe you send it with like Overpower for 8 and steal your opponent's like CNC or something. But the only issue is you can't play that CNC that turn, right? So you need to like basically like play it on like another turn instead. So what the RUM allows us to do is basically like use our opponent's cards with Red Lure Harpoon. So like that CNC that we banished that first turn, we can now use RUM to basically give the CNC go again. And then we can also chain that into another Harpoon. So we basically get like a double disruptive effect, which is really cool. So the addition of Red Lure Harpoon has made Tip the Barkeep a lot better. But Tip the Barkeep is also really good with Shallow Water Harpoon as well. So one common line that you can do with Shallow Water Harpoon is like, may give rum on like a King Shark Harpoon or something, and then if you have like 2 resources floating, since Shallow Water Shark Harpoon only cares about activating cannon this turn, and doesn't really care about necessarily like the overpower or whatever, basically we can just like use this as like almost like a finisher on our turn. So if we have like go again into Shallow Water, it's also just very, very strong, threatening like these double disruption turns. So Tip the Barkeep allows us to kind of like enable some of the strongest kind of combos in our deck. It's definitely very resource intensive, but it makes it kind of is like a very low opportunity cost card to play, as it's a blue 3 block. You can kind of like play it out maybe like turn 0 or just a turn where you have like a lot of tempo, and then eventually it will like pay for itself over the course of the game. All right, and the last blue I want to talk about here is Sift. But in order to talk about Sift, I kind of have to lay out my equipment, which I was going to get into in the next section. But what Sift does is basically allows us to play with this New Horizons game plan, which is kind of something that I've wanted to kind of build up to over kind of the course of the video. But we're talking about Sift now, I might as well talk about it in general. So Sift is entirely in the deck for New Horizons purposes. And New Horizons is a card that we want to run into some of these slower, kind of more grindy matchups. But what Sift allows us to do is basically set up these really interesting 6-card hands in our opener. So I kind of set up like an example hand here that you can kind of see. So we have Sift, King Shark Harpoon, Shallow Water Shark Harpoon, and Premeditate. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to basically like play the Sift. Maybe we end up drawing... maybe we end up just like bottoming like 1 card here. So let's say we like bottom the Shallow Water Shark Harpoon to Sift, and then we draw like another Sift or something like that. And what this does is it gives us a load trigger. Because we've drawn a card, we can basically like load this King Shark Harpoon face up into our arsenal. And then we can also just set up a face down arsenal as well. So when we basically like run New Horizons on turn 0, we have basically set up a double arsenal. So we're starting the game with a 6-card hand, which is incredibly strong. So basically it allows us to kind of keep tempo throughout the course of the game, set up these really powerful like overlap turns where maybe we can end up sending this King Shark Harpoon for like something like, if we have draw a hand like this, we can send this King Shark Harpoon for like 19, which is crazy. But yeah, Sift is in the deck to basically enable this kind of like New Horizons package, basically where we're like hopefully never really whiffing on New Horizons. Notably, we're going to talk about Quiver in a little bit as well, but notably Quiver also combos incredibly well with the New Horizons to kind of set up that face-up arsenal. All right, so now that we've talked basically through all of the main deck cards, I kind of want to talk about the equipment, which I probably should have done this first, to be honest, let's be real. But the equipment is also kind of very important to, I guess, like how the deck plays, and also just kind of like the context of the cards that we kind of decided to include. So I'm going to go through a little bit of a deep dive into a lot of these equipment. We'll kind of skip over some of just like the more generic value equipment. So Tunic, kind of a little bit self-explanatory, basically just giving us a resource every 3 turns is really, really good. Hammerhead Harpoon, we've kind of already touched on, but basically just like the key way to enable the deck. And then Gold-Baited Hook, also kind of just a kind of additional source of value generation. Most people who are familiar with Gravy are kind of familiar with the power of Hook, especially over the course of a long game. So I'm going to kind of skip over these for now. But let's go ahead and talk about some of the kind of like more interesting equipment. So I think the main kind of story that I want to talk about here is kind of like these 3 head slots, which kind of seems like a lot of head slots to include on a Flesh and Blood hero. Like, aren't these redundant? Yada, yada, yada. But these all 3 serve like a very important role. So for those of you kind of familiar with the channel kind of originally, basically the idea between Crown of Dominion and Honing Hood was that for matchups where our opponent puts us on first, we run Crown of Dominion so that we can start the game with the extra gold, which lets us either threaten additional damage on turn 0 or lets us just kind of like have a starting gold for the course of the game, which we can maybe play on, or which we may use on like the opening turn when we want to send like a huge damage turn. So Crown of Dominion is still like a very, very powerful card, and it combos incredibly well with Honing Hood. So I feel like into a lot of like the more aggressive matchups, there are a couple exceptions, but into most aggressive matchups, we actually want to be going second. And the reason for that is Honing Hood. So Honing Hood is a very cool card. It's basically like, what is this, Draft Chaff from
Aria.
Aria, basically, right? But yeah, Honing Hood has an incredibly powerful effect. So it basically allows us to kind of cheat an arsenal turn 0. So if our opponent attacks us for like 9 damage, basically what we can do is we can block like, maybe let's say we block like 7 on this with like 2 premeditates, and then we like, maybe we have our last card is like a King Shark Harpoon or whatever. But basically like what Honing Hood allows us to do is basically like cheat in a King Shark into our arsenal on turn 0. And it lets us start the game with like a ton of tempo. So basically it lets us start the game with a 5-card hand. Now, there are some like downsides to Honing Hood. So notably, if our opponent can push over the kind of like 9 damage threshold, assuming that our card's an average block 3, then Honing Hood gets a lot less value because our opponent is going to be like actually pushing damage over more than we're able to block, and then maybe we have to like leak damage, and then we don't get that free arsenal necessarily. But there are actually like a ton of the games, and there are a ton of decks in the game right now that can actually kind of do that, where they push 9 damage turn 0, and then like also don't let you keep an arsenal. So Honing Hood is still just a very, very powerful effect when going second. So I like to think of like Crown and Dominion going first, Honing Hood going second. And the third addition here that I kind of want to talk about is New Horizons. So we have this first, second game plan, but where does New Horizons kind of fit into this? So I want to give a lot of credit here to Nate Frautschy and Ben Weinfeld for kind of like developing this kind of like New Horizon strategy. But basically New Horizon is really good when you can have the game go incredibly long. So it's really good into kind of like the more grindy matchups like Victor, Gravy, and also into like Arachne Huntsman, for instance. Like those are like kind of like the top 3 I kind of think of off the top of my head, but there definitely are some more. But basically what New Horizons kind of allows us to do is basically set up these kind of like double arsenal plays, kind of like how we're talking through with Sift. And you might not always hit that double arsenal on turn 0. It's fairly likely with like Quiver and Sift that you hit it, but there is maybe like a decent percentage that you don't. And I think it's like something like 30-40% or something like that you don't hit that double arsenal. But into the matchups where you run your New Horizons, you should basically always be able to get the value out of it anyways. So New Horizons combos incredibly well with 3 of a kind. So if we're ever able to play 3 of a kind and resolve it, basically we're often able to kind of set a double arsenal, especially if we have a lot of extra resources floating in hand. And the reason why double arsenal is really powerful, by the way, maybe I didn't explain that, but it basically like gives us consistency over the course of the game where we're always able to send harpoons. And it also just gives us like a lot of redundancy and like the ability to set up these super wide turns. So New Horizon basically allows us to kind of like make the most out of like cards like Tip the Barkeep, where we're like making the rum. So then we can set up these like huge harpoons that also have like a Go-Again effect, like maybe like a shallow, like Go-Again King Shark into like a shallow water shark harpoon. So New Horizon is this very powerful value engine kind of tool that makes the most out of our 3 oaks and also kind of synergizes very well with the Tip the Barkeeps and letting us kind of go a bit wider. So again, I want to give a special shout out to Nate Frautschy and Ben Weinfeld for kind of like not discovering New Horizons, because I think New Horizons has been like a card that's been experimented for a while, but like kind of selling me on New Horizons at least, because I think it's really important to include in the deck. So yeah, that kind of tries to explain kind of like the different kind of niche use cases for our 3 HUD slots here. So basically Honing Hood and Crown Dominion kind of combo together, whether we're going first or second, and then New Horizons basically gives us this kind of like whether or not we're going first or second, basically this kind of like value engine into decks that are a little bit slower and kind of grindier. All right, next I kind of want to talk about Sea Lace Sarong a little bit. So actually Sea Lace has gotten a lot better with the inclusion of New Horizons, because it lets us kind of set up these like very powerful kind of turns. So Sea Lace is an instant speed, which lets us turn a blue arrow card in our arsenal face up. So what this means is we can actually use it to, the original use case was like giving like a blue harpoon go again. So like, for instance, like bluefin harpoon, we give it go again. It's kind of boring. Like we might not have like a ton to do after the bluefin harpoon. But actually it's like a lot more use cases when we kind of combo it with the New Horizons. So if we have like a 6-card hand and we turn up like a face down bluefin harpoon, we can actually use that go again like a lot more effectively. And also what Sea Lace Sarong lets us do is basically flip cards face up, so that if we're like maybe playing like a 3-oak that turn, we flip up the bluefin harpoon just so that it's face up, so we can maybe get like a second arsenal or something like that. So Sea Lace Sarong actually has like a lot of really interesting use cases in terms of like setting double arsenals up. Like one maybe kind of like other example that we can maybe look at is like, let's say like we have like a face down bluefin in our arsenal, And then we kind of just want to like block this turn maybe. Like maybe we have a hand that's like kind of bad. Like maybe it's like maybe it's like 3 reds and like a red fin, right? So if we have this card in our arsenal, what we can actually do is like maybe let's say we block like 9 with these cards. Maybe it's like a Spinal Crush or whatever. And then on our turn, what we can do is Sea Lace. We can flip this card face up so that we have a face up arsenal. And then we can just arsenal as King Shark face down. So let's just like set up these really cool double arsenal turns when we're on the New Horizons plan. And next, I kind of want to talk through the quivers of the deck. So there are 2 quivers here. I didn't actually end up using Enchanted Quiver all that much over the course of the weekend, as I just did pair into a lot of arcane damage heroes. But Quiver is still really important. I think it's especially good into like the new arcane variant of Basilio, where they're running like Aether Wildfire and just kind of like some of the other kind of like more kind of potent arcane effects. So you can often get like more than like 1 or 2 value off of Enchanted Quiver. Again, I didn't really end up running it this weekend, but I think it's still like a pretty reasonable sideboard slot. And then I want to also talk on Quiver Rustling Leaves. So this card is really cool, and it actually, I think originally in a lot of the Marlyn lists we were running like Abyssal Quiver just for some like late game value, but it's actually really cool that we're running Quiver Rustling Leaves now, because this card is just very, very flexible and like a very skill testing card. So the reason we're kind of running this is it combos incredibly well with New Horizons, but it also is just like generically good. So like if we don't have like an arrow in our opening hand, what we do is like maybe just like roll Quiver Rustling Leaves, see what the top card is, and maybe just kind of like get some filtering in, or also just like kind of maybe high roll like an arrow up the top of our deck. So Quiver Rustling Leaves ends up being actually like a fairly solid card in Marlyn. Again, most often you want to kind of combo with like New Horizons, and there's also like a really cool thing that you can do with Quiver Rustling Leaves, where you like can activate it twice on the stack. So basically what you do is you like activate it, and then you respond to the activation by paying another blue. And basically what this does is it lets you potentially even hit up to 2 arrows off the top of the deck, which is maybe incredibly relevant for like the New Horizons plan. So Quiver Rustling Leaf is just a really good bailout tool, general value card, just overall just a very solid kind of addition to the deck that kind of works really well with the New Horizons plan. And finally, I'm going to talk on our kind of like 2 little prevention equipment. So we have our Trench, which is Arcane Barrier 1. But also actually serves like a really interesting kind of role with New Horizons. So we'll kind of touch on this in a little bit once we talk through the sideboard a little bit, which the sideboard is fairly small, so we don't have much left to go in the video. But Trench of Sunken Treasure actually combos incredibly well with New Horizons in terms of clearing out unwanted cards from our arsenal. So like, let's say we basically like it lets us arsenal like weird cards like Sunken Treasure, or like cards that we like maybe don't want to like arsenal in the first place. And we can basically like convert those to resources our turn, or alternatively we can just like kind of sync them. And there's like actually like a very important reason why we want to sync cards in the first place, which I'll kind of touch on in a little bit. So we actually have 2 return fires in our sideboard, which means that we kind of have to actually like clear our arsenal so that we can actually get the return fire value. But Trench of Sunken Treasure is actually just a very powerful effect, being AV1, makes it just really good into like Acilio, Vincent, all the arcane damage heroes. But also gives us a lot of interesting synergy with Return Fire and also just like the New Horizons plan in general. One actual question I think people might ask in kind of like the comments is like, am I always running New Horizons and Trench together? I think the answer is like, it kind of depends. Like, I think I mostly use Trench when comboed with Return Fire, because I think this is like the strongest reason to run Trench. But I don't maybe run it if I'm like not running Return Fire, but I am running New Horizons. So there are a couple matchups where like I don't run Return Fire, but I do run New Horizons. So that might be a matchup where I opt for like Tunic over Trench. Although I think like Trench is still like a very, very solid card. And finally, on to our last piece of equipment here. So we have the Boots of Omnis War. So this is obviously like the kind of obvious use case for this is that it's a really strong effect into arcane damage dealing heroes like Vincent, Acilio, just anything that like sends like reasonable arcane damage like Aurora or something like that. So you can often get like up to 3 to 4 value, which is really powerful. But it actually has like this hidden kind of use case into Arachne Marionette. So into Arachne Marionette, what you want to do into them basically is use this kind of combo, I guess, with like Coning Hood. So like you ideally want to go second to Arachne Marionette and run like these 2 equipments. So what you're trying to do is basically prevent the flick trigger, because often what Marionette will want to do into you is basically like flick their dagger turn 1, just get you marked and then try to flip into a random arachne. What Boots of Omnisaur does is kind of stops that, so they have to actually... they can still like flick their dagger, but they might not get the mark effect, which denies them like the free roll, so it prevents really nasty effects like Inertia Trap off of Arachne Trapdoor, or just like other kind of bad effects for you, like maybe they roll into like an Orb Weaver or something like that. So Boots of Omnisaur is just really powerful. Even if they manage to like somehow mark you on the opening turn, like maybe they do like an attack react or something, what you can do is like you can just save Boots of Omnisaur, so if they get over the top, you lose the turn 0, but you can still probably get value over the course of the game if they try to go for like another flick or something at some point. Yeah, but that's basically the equipment suite, so pretty small kind of equipment setup, but I think a lot of these equipment serve very, very important roles, so a lot of them are kind of matchup dependent, but a lot of these are just kind of like your main deck generically kind of good equipment. For the last section, I kind of want to talk on the sideboard. So we've already kind of discussed a couple of these cards, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically like into most matchups, I'm trying to bring probably either 6 to 8 copies of basically like these 3 cards. So most matchups, I feel like I'm running like double Harpoon and also like 2 pre-med because I'm a pretty aggressive player. But often what I'll consider doing is into matchups, which we kind of talked about a little bit earlier. Like if the King Kraken Harpoon is bad, what I'll do is I'll bring in these kind of 6 cards into the 52 card main deck. And then I'll also kind of include these like 2 extra blues in here as the like throw caution. So basically like these kind of like 11 cards kind of like flex for each other in like a really interesting way. But yeah, the throw cautions we'll also kind of touch on in a little bit here, because I think this is like maybe like a little bit of a contentious pick where I'm not like super attached to throw caution. But throw caution is kind of like a hedge card. The reason why I brought throw caution to nationals is because I think it's actually like surprisingly good into like the more aggressive victor strategies where they're trying to like pummel you to death. We didn't really see a lot of that out of US nationals, so most of the victor lists ended up being a bit defensive, which I think was actually like better for me as like a Marlyn player. So throw caution is really good. It's especially good into just like being able to kind of flex with the King Shark and King Kraken plan, just in case like one of these Harpoons ends up being really bad. I think was really important. So throw caution lets us actually like go up to like 36 blues into matchups where we're running like the premeditates, which means that we're like a little bit more consistent in terms of like our deck, kind of cracking gold, doing all the things, that kind of thing. But yeah, throw cautions I think were also like an interesting hedge into the more arcane damage Acilio. So I actually ended up losing a lot into that deck when I was testing for US Nationals. And I think like throw cautions is maybe like a little bit of like cope into that deck, but I think it does probably help if you are able to actually kind of resolve it. We're going to also talk about return fire. So one of the best decks at US Nationals was Victor, and the way that we were kind of labbing the Victor matchup was basically like using return fire as like a very important value card for blocking out kind of like important on hits like Spinal Crush, Boulder Drop, and also just giving you like a lot of really interesting like fatigue equity. So I ran 2 copies of return fire because I think this card does get pretty awkward in multiples, but I feel like return fire was I think a pretty comfy spot. And I often combo this with like Trench of Sunken Treasure, basically to like sink an arsenal if I don't already have one. But there is actually kind of like an interesting thing you can do with New Horizons, which I'll kind of touch on in a bit, because I did actually manage to do this play. So basically what you can do with like Return Fire and New Horizons is if you have like a bad card in your arsenal, maybe you don't have like a way to get rid of it. Maybe like you have like a face-up card or something, you just like, maybe like 2 face-up cards or something like that. But you can actually kind of combo these together. So like New Horizons will actually like break your arsenals, and then Return Fire will bring your arsenal back, which is really cool. So it lets you like clear bad cards from your arsenal so that you have like the ability to return fire in maybe like a good arrow like King Shark Harpoon or something. But it's actually really cool. I think that the return fires are like a really interesting payoff for running the New Horizons. You don't really want to run these into everyone. They're best into decks that want to be doing like a little bit of back and forth. Like Victor basically wants to be swinging at you almost every turn, so you're almost always able to kind of get the return fire value. And just having the extra block cards into decks that are like a little bit more disruptive, like maybe into Aggro Blaze's Betsy deck, or just into like the Marlyn Mirror, maybe you run these. Like They have like a lot of like interesting applications where you can kind of just like get over like some certain disruptive effects and stuff like that. So I really actually like their return fires, and I think they combo especially well with New Horizons. They're also pretty good into gravy, which we'll kind of talk about our little gravy package here in a minute. But just being able to like block out a Conqueror of the High Seas and then just like load like an Endless Arrow or something is very strong. All right, so last we're going to talk through the Endless Arrow and the Pilfer the Tomb. So the Endless Arrows were, I think, a kind of contentious inclusion, I guess, when we're doing kind of like our Marlynn Council kind of testing team. But basically, like, the Endless Arrows, I think, are really important for just kind of buying tempo in the Gravy matchup. And I'm basically only playing these cards into Gravy because I think Gravy was one of the better decks in the room at US Nationals. But these ended up letting me go 3-0 into the Gravies I faced over US Nats the weekend. And it basically lets you kind of keep the allies under control while you kind of wait for the Gravy to kind of like run out of steam or kind of just brick out. So against a lot of good Gravies, they'll actually have like a lot of counterplay to the Endless Arrow strategy. Like maybe they try to send like a double Conqueror of the High Seas and try to force you off of an arsenal. So you could like maybe just like trench away your Endless and then like hopefully you have like another Endless in hand or some way to like get it back. But there is like a lot of agency that good Gravy players will have into the Endless plan. So this by itself, I think, is like not enough. You also kind of maybe need like one or two additional little tech cards here to maybe hate Gravy a little bit more. So a special shout out to, I guess, Lupine Fiasco for giving me the Pilfer the Tomb last minute. So this is actually like a last minute inclusion in the deck. And I think I basically like cut the Trench and Quick Dodge Flexor plan to include a little bit more Gravy insurance. So Pilfer the Tomb is really cool because it lets you, it just ruins your Gravy opponent's day. It's great. So basically I turned over like Whaler Humperdinck against one Gravy. I turned over Chum against another Gravy. The card was just great all weekend, just like a very solid hate piece in the Gravy, and just lets you like if you're trying to go for like this more, you can't always fatigue Gravy, but sometimes you can kind of bring them to this kind of like fatigue end state where you're trying to like eventually when they run out of allies, you like disrupt them with like King Shark Harpoon and King Kraken. But Pilfer lets you like get to that end state like a lot quicker, which I think is really important. So I like Pilfer as like one of, maybe as a two of, if you're really respecting Gravy over the coming nationals. But I think Pilfer is like just a very solid include. Like maybe you want like a 4 Gravy card sideboard or maybe like a 5. But I feel like Pilfer, the one of Pilfer ended up being like just enough to kind of beat the 3 Gravies that I ended up facing over US Nats weekend. All right, so anyways, that pretty much wraps up my US Nats Marlynn list. There's also like a little article that you can look on Fab TCG that I think like just came out like an hour ago while we're recording this. So really, really cool article. And also just, I think the deck actually came out really, really well for US Nats. And I'm pretty proud of like how we did. We ended up 7-2 in CC for a 39th place finish. So getting some nice little cash as well. So again, I want to give like a special thanks and shout out to some of the kind of people who are developing the deck. So Ben Weinfeld and Nate Frautschy are religious Marlynn players. They'll basically, they put thousands of games on the deck and they came up with, I think, a lot of the really important developments of like New Horizons, Return Fire, that kind of strategy. And basically just like helped me kind of like lap through a lot of the deck building choices. And I think they were both also on Marlynn doing pretty well this weekend. So I think Marlynn as a whole actually had a really strong showing at US Nationals. I think we had like just under a 60% win rate, which is one of like the best performing decks at US Nationals, which is really, really cool. So I'm actually feeling incredibly good about the deck. So not only do I just like this deck, I think it's I wouldn't play the deck if it was bad, right? I think that this deck is actually like in a very powerful position right now. I think it's probably maybe in the most powerful position it's been in since like it came out in high seas. Like the deck has just been getting better and better, which is great. I'm a little bit, the only concern I have about this deck is that with the onset of Mastery Pack Warrior, maybe the deck gets a little bit harder to play if Warriors become like a dominant force in the meta, which they kind of deserve to be at this point. But yeah, I think for national season, this deck is just incredibly powerful. And I think it's a deck that not a lot of people are practicing into. So you'll have a lot of your opponents just reading your cards for the first time. You'll have a lot of opponents who are making misblocks, making mistakes because they just don't have the familiarity of playing into Marlynn. So yeah, that basically kind of covers the deck. I think that Marlynn is one of the most strongly positioned heroes right now. If you have the reps, you have the deck list, and you have the time to kind of devote the practice to playing the deck. And I think she's one of the best choices for upcoming nationals if you're looking to kind of play an off-meta deck that can potentially get a lot of really good, impressive matchup spreads. All right, but anyways, this has been my Marlin deck tech. I'm actually going to be working on a little like free Metafy guide to hopefully kind of cover some of the kind of like matchups for this deck. So that'll probably be like, coming out like sometime later this week once I kind of like sit down and write it. But that'll be like a free resource for people to kind of use, and we'll kind of talk through like a couple of these matchups in a little bit more detail. But again, special shout out to Ben Weinfeld and Nate Frautschy for a lot of the work that they did on the deck. And I also had a couple little inclusions in the form of the pre-mets as well. But yeah, thank you to everyone who has kind of helped work on this deck and kind of like given me the testing. All right, anyways, thank you all for watching. Hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time. And a special thank you to all the folks who decided it would be a good idea to give us $2 on Patreon. We really appreciate the support, but it's obviously never required.